Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. This video is going to be part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1215, titled Robert G Ingersoll, Benevolent Agnostic, written by Joseph McCabe. Copyright 1927. Yes, this one actually has the copyright date. And we're going to start off with Chapter 2, The Infidel Makes Good. The decisive refutation of the idea that Ingersoll owed his fine character to his early religious environment is the fact that he was that's what the sentence says, in the fact that he was turned 25 and left Christianity far behind him before he attracted any attention. If up to that date he had been esteemed for anything, it was for a quality, his sparkle, his love of sunshine, which no one would dream of tracing to his home or his parents or his creed. The two chief biographers seem to contradict each other at this stage. Smith, who ought to know best, says that at the age of 29 Ingersoll had not yet done anything, and was just an obscure young attorney like 1,000 others. Kitteridge, on the contrary, gives Ingersoll a brilliant reputation and great prosperity in his 25th year. The truth, no doubt, lies between the two. In 1855, Robert went into law partnership with his brother Clark, or Eben Clark. I wonder why the brother has a different name. Wonder if it's a loose term for brother. I don't know. Anyhow, they went into partnership at Shawneetown, but in 1857, they were prosperous enough to move to Peoria, a larger and busier town. Here, unquestionably, Ingersoll made a name, and to make a name at the Illinois bar in those days was not a light achievement. Lincoln and the other able lawyers were in the field. The Peoria, no, it's not an R, the Peoria. My brain wants to put an R in there and call it Peoria. The Peoria Journal said at his death that the Peoria Journal said at his death that from 1857 onward, he was much in demand for his services. But this chronicle of his steps is not of so much interest here as the story of his inner development. It was in these years, from 25 to 30, that the young infidel made good, and it is a pity that he has left us no intimate autobiography of them. His biographers tell us punctuously, at what date he left one third-rate town in Illinois for another, what the address of his law office was, and how many times the name of the brass plate changed. Meantime, he was evolving rapidly into a personality of equal charm and power. A rare combination. And it seems to be to them of no more interest than the color he chose for the painting of his house. It is the fashion of biographers. We have to construct his evolution partly from general experience. He was one of thousands the world over who were then passing from Christianity to agnosticism, and partly from the way in which he fiercely exposes his inspirations in his lectures. Freely exposes. What manner of man he was, I will describe in the 5th chapter, but both his personality and his motives will sufficiently appear throughout. He was the last man in the world to do anything because his father had told him to do it, and on false grounds or because he had contracted the habit of doing it in childhood. The arch-rebel against tradition, the man who most eloquently denounced the common habit of following traditional or conventional modes of behavior without seriously reflecting on them, cannot without absurdity be accused of practicing Christian virtues because he had once been a Christian. The easiest and most profitable Christian virtue in a provincial American town in the 1850s was attendance at church, and Ingersoll repudiated it. Two incidents of the year 1860 show that he had at least fixed his principle by that date. Although only 27 years old, he was asked to stand as Democratic candidate for Congress against the Republican Judge Kellogg. He lost because of his honesty and humanity. Democratic on most points, he was as an abolitionist, fiercely opposed to the Democrats, and wholly on the side of Lincoln, on what was considered to be the most important point of all. With that scorn of compromise and consequences, which was to distinguish his whole career, he used his Democratic platform to pour a flood of fiery human resentment on the institution of slavery. It was splendid, but it was not war. He was on the wrong side. A few years later, he felt that the anti-slavery issue outweighed all others, and he passed for the rest of his life to the Republican Party. God, he'd be so ashamed of what the Republican Party has become, and so surprised by what the Democratic Party has become. They've switched sides. Digress. The other incident of 1860 is that he then delivered his first rationalist lecture at Peking, Illinois. It was entitled Progress. And to deliver it at the very opening of his legal career was so bold and dangerous an act that it gives us some measure of his unconquerable honesty. He would know how Lincoln had paid for his infidelity, even for a private expression of a very limited skepticism. He remembered that his school had been wrecked at Metropolis by a light joke at the expense of a very secondary religious practice. He was attracted to the political world in which a man may do what he likes, but must say only what the high priest direct. And he depended for his future upon clients who were, in great part, very sensitive to the sulfurated odor of infidelity. He never hesitated. We have the lecture as it was repeated some years later, and the closing words will suffice to show how bold it was, and that Ingersoll was already venturing a little shakily upon the highly figurative oratory in which he was to excel. And here's the last bit of that. We are standing on the shore of an infinite ocean, whose countless waves, frightened with blessings, are welcoming our adventurous feet. Progress has been written on every soul. The human race is advancing. Forward, O sublime army of progress, forward until law is justice. Forward until ignorance is unknown. Forward while there is a spiritual or a temporal throne. Forward until superstition is a forgotten dream. Forward until the world is free. Forward until human reason, clothed in the purple of authority, is King of Kings. It is far from perfect. Waves do not, as a rule, welcome our feet. But it drew attention. Either the lecture had an extensive echo, or Ingersoll gave several such lectures, for in the autumn of the following year, when he was to defend a case at Groveland, a noted skeptic of the district came to see and hear him. Mr. Weld Parker was a cultivated Bostonian, His home was appreciated by more than one American of distinction who passed that way, and both he and his wife had studied Paine, or Thomas Paine, so well that they had, unlike him, applied his reason and common sense to God as well as to Christianity, and were in effect, agnostics. A charming daughter, in so charming and congenial a home, to which Ingersoll was promptly invited, seemed almost a melodramatic arrangement of affairs, and on February 13th, 1862, Ingersoll married Eva Parker. Ingersoll I never saw or heard. These pages may seem cold if compared with the glowing eulogies of biographers who had felt all the thrall of his eloquence and the glow of his personality. But, on the other hand, the lack of that experience will give the reader some security that my estimate is based upon the recorded facts and upon private letters of Ingersoll's that have passed through my hands. But Mrs. Ingersoll, the Eva Parker of 1862, I have often met in the home of the family at New York. I dislike gush and will say only, in hackneyed phrase, but with sincere meaning, that Ingersoll found an ideal mate. As late as 1913 and 1917, I found the home somehow so full of the spirit and presence of Robert Ingersoll that it was difficult to believe that he was not merely at work uptown and would drop in for dinner. I will say more of it in the 5th chapter. Agnostic like himself, moved and directed by the same high ideals as himself, proud of him and devotedly attached to him, conscious that through him she was working for the world and working for him and his children, Eva Ingersoll found the thing which is as beautiful as it is rare, a perfect home. And she gave American mothers for all time a refulgent, it's a strange word, refulgent example of an entirely sweet and harmonious and serviceable family life, without a little of either the letter or the spirit of Christianity. They married, as I said, in February 1862, and a month later, the bridegroom was off to war. Kitteridge is wrong in saying that he was now a Republican. He did not change until 1863. But since his cradle, almost, he had been an abolitionist. War, bloodshed, violence, hatred, he always detested. But like Thomas Paine, if neighbors would not agree to peace, he thanked heaven that he had a musket. In the autumn of 1861, he got permission to raise a regiment of cavalry, and in October he found himself colonel of the 11th Illinois Cavalry Volunteers, the Democratic Regiment. The winter was spent in training, and he boldly married on the eve of his departure. It was a bolder venture than now. None of the dreary folk who talk about modern science and war seem to know that the Civil War was twice as deadly to the combatants as the European War was in 1918. I'll pause there because I'm getting dry. Cottonmouth creepeth in. Okay, we're ready. Ingersoll was popular with his officers and men and was a good soldier. It is all that concerns us. His character was already firm enough for any test. He would give a wounded man his cover and sleep in the rain. And the last phase illustrates how sincerely and spontaneously human his impulses were. A day came when his force of 800 men, 300 of them poorly equipped and 200 meeting fire for the first time, were outnumbered by 10 to 1. Ingersoll made a skillful effort to extricate his men, and they stood the fire with all the unembroidered heroism of the time. I think it was General Leonard Wood who once told me about a similar situation in the Civil War, when an excited aide came rushing up to General whatever it doesn't say. We sat on a fence, quietly chewing a straw, and announced that the transport had not come up. "Well," he said calmly, "I guess if we win, we won't need it. And if we're licked, we won't need it either." Ingersoll saw that further resistance was quite useless, and would therefore be criminal on his part. "Stop firing," he shouted. "I'll acknowledge your damned old Confederacy." The troopers got away where they could, and General Forrest, who took him, angrily asked him who was supposed to be in command. "If you keep a secret, I'll tell you," said Colonel Ingersoll. I was. They became warm personal friends. Ingersoll gave his parole, and he was sent to take charge of a camp of prisoners on parole at St. Louis. There seemed, as time went on, no chance of his returning to the field, and he resigned his commission and returned to civil life in Peoria. Probably the Confederates little realized that his tongue was mightier than his sword, for he now used it with prodigious effect to spur the Northerners. Smith tells so circumstantial a story of his passing over to the Republican ranks in St. Louis that he cannot doubt it. Politically now, as well as by his zeal against slavery and his admiration of Lincoln's skepticism, he was entirely on the side of the president, and he worked devotedly. Colonel Carr says, come on, turn the page. Pardon me. Colonel Carr says, "No man can estimate the power and influence of Ingersoll in arousing the American people to a sense of their solemn responsibilities when the war came upon them, or in awakening them to a sense of justice and a proper appreciation of the rights of man." Possibly Americans of the present generation hardly realize how deep the need was. My friend Major Putnam, a survivor of those days, told me that the exhaustion and wearifulness of France and Britain in 1917 were far less than the misery of the northern states in 1864. Brilliant success in court and on the platform made Ingersoll so well known that in 1866 he became Attorney General for Illinois, and in 1868, at the Republican State Convention, his name was put forward by a large number of the delegates. Smith says 3/4 of them, as candidate for the governorship of Illinois. He wanted to be governor. In fact, he wanted very much to be governor. His gifts as an orator seemed to fit him, particularly for the acquisition of political power. And power to him meant power to do good. But mark well his conduct, you who, from living all your lives in a religious environment, have some honest difficulty in understanding how the moral spine remains healthy when religion is abandoned. I will take it that you know how politicians usually surmount the little difficulties and obstacles in the way of office. Ingersoll, the infidel, acted otherwise. A group of gentlemen summoned him and explained suavely to him that the governorship was within his reach, if these talks about religion could be. "Goodbye, gentlemen," Ingersoll said, politely taking up his hat. A preacher called on to him to ascertain if he really was one of those wicked infidels. Ingersoll, engaging him in conversation, put before him an open book and asked his opinion of the page at which it was opened. It was undeniably fine and idealistic. And the author, said Ingersoll, when the preacher admitted this is Voltaire, in spite of his gentle art of making enemies, Ingersoll was wanted for the governorship, but it was pointed out to him that he must cease to criticize religion. He replied, "Gentlemen, I am not asking to be governor of Illinois. My position I would not, under any circumstances, even for my life, seem to renounce. I would rather refuse to be President of the United States than do so. My religious belief is my own. It belongs to me, not to the state of Illinois. I would not smother one sentiment of my heart to be the emperor of the round globe." Clearly he was not fit, people said, to be a governor of Illinois, and the political door seemed to be slammed against him. This is not, as Smith pretends, literally true, for we shall find him in a far stronger political position presently, and we shall find him sacrificing it for the same sense of honor and truth. A sincere and thoughtful religious reader would ask me 2 questions, and I will answer them as sincerely. Why should Ingersoll make such sacrifices for the liberty to attack religion? And how can a utilitarian theory of morals explain such an attitude? The answer to the first is in part that Ingersoll regards religion as a worse hindrance to progress than political blunders. But the main answer is that he could not help making the sacrifice. And this must be explained by the answer to the second question. Ingersoll, like most Americans, was an intense individualist, which I need not say is a very different thing from selfishness. He chose, as a man has a right to do, within the limits of the rights of his fellows, his own standard of life. He personally loathed hypocrisy and lying and cruelty, just as he loathed dirt. To form a character on those tastes, let us for the moment leave it as a matter of taste, means to give it a certain inertia, which will often carry it forward when there is no logical reason. If you have formed a generous, straight, honest character, it will express itself in an honest act, just as that of the thief will spontaneously express itself in a dishonest act. Yep, we're going to pause there. A little hydration. But there is much more logic in these things than preachers seem to understand, said a retired senator to me. I never took a bribe in my life, but they always knew where my overcoat was. Which would you prefer, quite apart from questions of God or hell, to see as the normal and recognized standard of American character, that of the grifter or that of Ingersoll? You began at once to see how there can be utility in honor and honesty. I have explained this in an earlier little blue book, The Human Origins of Morals, number 1061. And need add here that Ingersoll, at the close of his career, had certainly no occasion to lament that honesty was costly. A great contractor, Sir George Jackson, who built the Trans-Andean Railway and made $1 million profit by it, privately assured me that honesty had paid him well all his life. No doubt Ingersoll was sagely criticized, even ridiculed, by smaller men in Peoria at the time, but when he died, a meeting of its responsible citizens put on record this sentiment. When the highest honors of the state were his, if he would but avoid the discussion of the questions that relate to futility. No, futurity. Yeah, futurity. I had to look this one up. Futurity. He avowed his belief. At the time that he made his stand, there was before him only the prospect of loss and of the scorn of the public. And we desire to record the fact that we feel that he was greater than a martyr, greater than a saint, greater than a mere hero. He was a thoroughly honest man. Ingersoll wanted no halo. I believe that if his shade did indeed stand beside me as I write this, and could speak to me, he would ask me to add a little to the explanation I have given. Between puffs of his ethereal cigar, he would say, "My boy, I simply hated and loathed the damn business of toadying in order to get political office. It was quite time that somebody said what every decent man thought. I could afford to do it. Certainly, I should have liked to be governor, but by God, I would rather have the luxury of spitting on these contemptible traditions than hold any office." Not so would Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius talk. But it is a profound pity that more people do not use this robust language. It is more needed than the Sermon on the Mount, and our age understands it. Ingersoll toiled on, and his fame grew. Two daughters brought joy to his sunny home. A library began to sprawl over its walls. He filled up the gaps in his education. Darwin's Origin of the Species, published in 1859, and the following works of Huxley and Haeckel came over the sea. And he got a grip of nature, Burns, Shakespeare, and Dickens, and the best American poets and fiction writers. He knew as few men do today. He had the rare faculty of recognizing that culture means education and fine emotions as well as in science and history. So rich and luxuriant was his humanism, his joy and pride in all that is good in human nature, his sympathy with its defects and failures, that to seek any other inspiration of his generous impulses is like looking for an angel in the works of an automobile. Burns and Shakespeare were his Bible. And this throbbing human sentiment demanded expression, and after a few years of discipline of his speech, made him, beyond any question, the greatest orator of the English-speaking world. And that's the end of chapter 2 of Little Blue Book number 1215, titled Robert G. Ingersoll, Benevolent Agnostic, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1927. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.